All right, coming up in here to our final part, we have a meeting about some publishing revelations stuff, as well as Doctrine and Covenants, section 83, as we have it today. So this meeting that we're talking about is part of Minute Book 2. Again, that's the handwriting of Ebenezer Robinson. Takes place at the end of April, so April 1832. This is the 30th of April. The entire text of it is pretty short, so I'll just read it off to you. It says, Minutes of a Council of the Literary Firm, Zion, April 30, 1832, and that means Independence, Missouri. That's where we are right now. Who was present? Joseph Smith Jr., President. Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, William W. Phelps, John Whitmer, Jesse Gauss, one of the President's counselors. Ordered by the council that 3,000 copies of the Book of Commandments be printed in the first edition. That's it. We're going to do 3,000 copies. Now, footnote 3 to these minutes says, in a January 1832 letter to Joseph Smith, Cowdery reported that the plan to print 10,000 copies would require twice, quote, the amount of the first mentioned reams. This calculation probably factored into the firm's new plan for a reduced print run of the first edition, while allowing for the prospect of one or more subsequent editions. So the overall goal was 10,000 full copies. They got to 3,000. And they didn't get quite to that much because the press was attacked. But the idea was that over time, they were going to produce a lot of these, a ton of these things. And if you recall, they published about 5,000 copies of the original Book of Mormon. So, they're sort of expanding themselves. And obviously, there were other printing editions of the Book of Mormon as well after this, but this is what they did. And that's it. That's all that we get from that. So we're going to move on to an introduction to section 83 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Once again, we're in the Newell K. Whitney papers. This is the Isaac Grew collection that was handed over to BYU. It is in the handwriting of Sidney Rigdon, like everything else. And then if you flip over the page, Newell K. Whitney gets his pencil out again and says, as to women and children, inheritance at Zion, 30th of April, 1832, written in graphite. It is actually cut from a book. You can see that one of the pages is sort of cut, probably using a knife. And the bottom portion is missing, kind of torn away here as I can see it. But of course, it's hard to really know that, in my opinion, because, age does its thing. Another version of this is actually found in Sidney Gilbert's notebook. It is a very short revelation, but this is in the hand of Sidney Gilbert. You get that. You also get it in Revelation Book 1, and it is crossed out. The word those is added by William W. Phelps, but there is a big old large X through this section. It's kind of funny that that's the case because it was published in the Evening and Morning Star, Doctrine and Covenants, once again in the Evening and Morning Star manuscript history. So not sure what the X was for, but we do get it there in the 1833 edition. It's also in Revelation Book 2, handwriting of Frederick G. Williams. And the biggest thing here that's changed is that women have claim on their husbands, and then Frederick G. Williams adds for their maintenance, which is a very interesting addition. There's also an addition at the very end of this that we'll get to in a moment that really clarifies, well, what if something doesn't work out? So they're really keen on making sure that they take care of the women at this time. And we're going to get into why I think this is very remarkable and quite forward-thinking for its time. So we'll get to that in a second. But yes, it also shows up as Section 88 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. It's in the 1835 year edition of the Evening and Morning Star, as well as in the manuscript history of the church. So there's all the places you'll find it contemporary to Joseph Smith. So the circumstances surrounding this, the Newell K. Whitney paper only gives us Zion, May 30th or 31st, 1832. So not much there. Sidney Gilbert's notebook just dates it. Revelation Book 1 only really says 80, given that numbering. A revelation received in Zion, April 30, 1832. Not much else in Revelation Book 2. The Evening and Morning Star actually gives us a little more. It says, items in addition to the laws for the government of the church, given April 1832. Okay? Very little in either the Evening and Morning Star, Doctrine and Covenants. We don't get a whole lot. Very short from the manuscript history, which says, on the 30th, I returned to Independence and again sat in council with the brethren and received the following revelation given April 1832. So according to a later Joseph Smith history, and this is from the historical introduction, so we're in Documents Volume 2. According to a later Joseph Smith history, Joseph Smith sat in council with the brethren on the 30th of April, 1832 in Independence, Jackson County, Missouri. and dictated a revelation clarifying the rights of women and children who had lost their husbands or fathers. Although there were civil laws outlining specific property rights for women upon the death of their husbands, it was not clear what would happen if a husband had consecrated property to the church. The 30th of April revelation helped clarify the church's position in such instances. So now you're getting into a couple of things where legally the church starts to depart, and Joseph Smith starts to depart from widely held legal beliefs at the time in the United States. So we get further into this from the historical introduction. According to Missouri statutes, a woman had no claim on her personal property when she married, giving up that right to her husband. If her husband died, a woman had a dower right or a right to a third part of her husband's real estate. She was also, quote, entitled absolutely to a share, unquote, in her husband's other personal estate. That was, quote, equal to the share of a child of such deceased husband after the payment of debts. The doctrine of consecration was established in the laws of the Church of Christ, and subsequent revelations did not address what claims a widow had on property her husband had consecrated to the church, or what would happen to children who lost their fathers. So to put this in other words, if your husband died back then, you had to pay all these debts first, and then you got a third of it, and maybe a share of their personal estate and other things. So women were definitely harmed by this, as well as their children, which is interesting. I mean, if your child's a young man, like, you're kind of hurting men as well. So the law is a little strange, at least in our terms today. So then there's an impetus for this question, which I find very interesting. From the historical introduction, once again, says, Joseph Smith apparently became concerned about such questions while in Missouri in April of 1832. Perhaps one reason was his short trip from the 20th and 29th April to visit the saints from Colesville, New York, who had settled about 12 miles west of Independence in Caw Township, Missouri. Joseph Smith had good friends in the settlement, including the Knight family. Remember Joseph Knight? He later reported that he, quote, received a welcome only known by brethren and sisters united as one in the same faith, unquote. Among those living in Caw Township were at least two widows, Phoebe Crosby Peck, who had 4 children, and Anna Slade Rogers, who had a daughter. These women's husbands died in 1829 before the revelation on the, quote, laws of the Church of Christ was dictated. But Joseph Smith's association with them may have prompted him to wonder about a widow's claim to consecrated property, which may in turn have led to this 1830 April revelation, this 30th of April revelation. So the content and footnotes of this, well, it's a very short one, so I'll just give it to you. The revelation reads this: Verily thus saith the Lord, in addition to the laws of the church concerning women and children who belong to the church, who have lost their husbands or fathers, women have claim on their husbands until they are taken, and if they are not found transgressors, they remain upon their inheritances. All children have claim upon their parents until they are of age, and after that they have claim upon the church, or in other words, the Lord's storehouse, for inheritances. Now that's the original copy. So if you remember, Frederick G. Williams later added, they have claim on their husbands for their maintenance until they are taken, is what it says. So a big clarification there. What kind of, no ambiguity about what husbands are supposed to be doing. It's very generous to women and children. So footnote 3 to this. What does this mean? Okay. Later deeds of consecration contain similar language, stating that upon the death of the individual consecrating the property, quote, his wife or widow, being at the same time a member of the church, has claim on the property upon precisely the same conditions that her said husband had them. Deeds also stated that orphans had claim on their parents' inheritance, quote, for their support until they shall become of age. Under Missouri law, children came of age when they were 21, which I find very interesting. I'm not sure what coming of age is in today's terms. I want to say it's 18. Like, that's when we're legal adults in the United States. So a very interesting one. Now, just to reiterate that again, the wife gets all of it, not a third of it, right? And the idea that the consecrated property might also be nice because maybe there are no debts to settle. So once again, the law of consecration actually is returning quite a large amount of wealth back to these people that they didn't have before, which I find very interesting because, the idea that you're going to give your property over to the church would mean that you obviously, it's not yours anymore, it's the church's. But what they do is when they divide back to them what they need, a lot of them got more back than what they had originally. And then if something were to happen to them, they're not under Missouri law in this case because the church owns it. And the church gets to dictate what it does, and the widows get all of it, and so do their children until they're 21. So this is a really generous offering. I thought was very, very interesting and very forward-thinking in terms of women's rights back then and the rights of children. So footnote 4 as well to this revelation says, although the revelation begins with a statement about children who had lost their fathers, the remainder of the revelation does not explain how the church would help such children. Perhaps for this reason, the version of this revelation that Frederick G. Williams recorded in Revelation Book 2, sometime in 1834, as well as the published version in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, replaced for inheritances with, so this is what we get now, if their parents have not wherewith to give them inheritances, and the storehouse shall be kept by the consecrations of the church, that widows and orphans shall be provided for, as also the poor. And our current scriptures say the same thing. This was not printed in the original Evening and Morning Star, but everything since then makes it very clear that these storehouses are there for widows and children. Like the church definitely enfolds everyone. So this is a pretty significant thing as far as, again, the rights of women and children. How do we deal with the poor? Maybe your husband didn't have consecrated properties. How do we deal with you as well? Very interesting, and I think a very touching revelation, and something that I would submit today is something that we do. We do have tithing in the church, which is sort of a general church fund, and I know they use that for humanitarian efforts and helping the poor and building buildings and all sorts of stuff like that. They have their investment properties and all those kinds of things that also generate cash flows for the church. But then we have this thing called fast offerings, and if you're not familiar with that, every once a month we fast and we give what we would consider the cost of our food or whatever we might have used to the church, and that is more of a local fund, and that's definitely set aside for people who are in distress and need. So it's food, it's money, it's maybe you need help paying bills. That's definitely still something today, and I would submit that a lot of the dictation of that and a lot of the way that we do things today harkens back to this section. And the fact that the church was very forward-thinking about giving these widows and orphans as much as they could to get them on their feet. Because, in my opinion, and one of the reasons why I think the church puts so much into education is because the church does better when its members are strong and independent. Way better. And definitely back then and definitely today. So some very interesting things. Maybe a little unexpected, but a couple of unpublished revelations, a couple of minutes of meetings. Hopefully that wasn't boring or anything. I think a lot of this stuff is very interesting. Our next episode is going to be very doctrinal. This is going to be section 84, which is another very long sort of section 72-esque revelation, although it is not a vision. It is not quite as significant, but we're just going to be going after that one and maybe a few other unpublished things as well. So hopefully you're having a good time with this, and we'll see you next week. This is the Amateur Historian saying, take care of your own. They're worth taking care of. Have a good week.